The year is 1887. In the gaslit streets of Whitechapel, a woman named Catherine Eddowes walks toward her death, but she doesn't know it yet. Her footsteps echo against wet cobblestones as she makes her way through the fog-shrouded maze of London's most desperate quarter. Behind her, unseen, something follows. Not just a killer, but a shadow that would haunt the city for decades, spawning thousands of theories, hundreds of suspects, and one truth that investigators are only now beginning to understand. What happened to Catherine Eddowes wasn't random. It wasn't the work of a madman stalking victims in the dark. It was something far more calculated, something that connects to a network so vast and so carefully hidden that when you see the evidence, you'll understand why Scotland Yard buried the files for over a century. The question isn't who Jack the Ripper was, it's who he was working for. If you've ever wondered why some crimes become legends while others disappear into police archives, you're about to find out. Here on Your Channel Name, we dig into the Victorian shadows that history tried to forget. Asylum records, Masonic Lodge documents, royal physicians' notes sealed in private collections. Every view, every like, every subscription helps us pull one more secret out of the London fog. Now let's go back to that October night, because Catherine Eddowes is about to become the key that unlocks everything. But to understand what really happened to her, you need to understand the machine that consumed her. 3 months earlier, in August 1888, the first body had been found. Mary Ann Nichols, throat slashed, lying in Buck's Row like a broken doll. The newspapers called it brutal. The police called it isolated. But Dr. George Bagster Phillips, the police surgeon who examined her body, called it something else entirely. Professional. Phillips had seen death before. 23 years cutting open victims of violence, disease, and desperation in London's East End. He knew the difference between rage and precision. When he lifted the sheet covering Mary Ann Nichols, what he saw made him step back, not because of the brutality, but because of the skill. The killer knew anatomy, not the crude knowledge of a butcher or a dock worker with a sharp knife. This was surgical precision, someone who understood the human body the way a pianist understands keys, someone who had cut flesh before, who knew exactly where to press, where to slice, where to probe. Phillips wrote 3 words in his initial report. They were crossed out, erased from the official record, but they survived in his private notes, discovered only in 1987 when his estate was donated to the Royal London Hospital Archives. Medical training evident. 8 days later, Annie Chapman was found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. Phillips arrived just after dawn to find something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Chapman's body had been arranged, not just killed, but positioned with deliberate care. Her belongings placed in a neat line beside her feet, her rings arranged by her head, and the wounds. Phillips later told his wife he had never seen anatomical dissection performed with such precision outside of a teaching hospital. But here's what the newspapers didn't report, what the police kept from the public, what wasn't discovered until 1982, when a researcher named Patricia Cornwell gained access to sealed Metropolitan Police files. Annie Chapman was missing something. A specific organ, removed with surgical expertise, taken as if by someone who knew its exact location and value. That's when Dr. Phillips realized what they were dealing with. This wasn't random violence, this was collection. Someone was hunting specific women for specific purposes, someone with medical knowledge, surgical tools, and access to information about potential victims, someone who could move through London's East End without suspicion. Someone who belonged there. Or someone who was protected by those who did. Elizabeth Stride died on September 30th. Catherine Eddowes died the same night, 4 hours later, half a mile away. 2 murders in one evening, both bearing the same surgical precision, both involving the same calculated extraction of organs. The newspapers called it the double event. The police called it escalation. But Dr. Phillips called it something else. In a letter to his colleague Dr. Thomas Bond, discovered in Bond's papers at the Royal College of Surgeons in 1991, Phillips wrote, I fear we are not dealing with one madman, but with an organized effort. The precision suggests training, the access suggests protection, the organs suggest commerce. Commerce. Not rage, not madness, not the random violence of London's brutal streets. Commerce. Because in 1888, there was a market for human organs. Medical schools across Europe paid handsomely for fresh anatomical specimens. Private collectors sought rare pathological samples. And certain gentlemen's clubs in London's West End held gatherings where medical curiosities were displayed like fine art. Catherine Eddowes worked as a casual laborer, cleaning offices in the financial district during the day, returning to Whitechapel each night. She knew the streets, knew which corners were safe, which alleys to avoid. But on October 9th, she made a mistake. She met someone she trusted. The witness statements, buried for decades in Scotland Yard's confidential files, tell a story the public never heard. 3 different people saw Catherine Eddowes that night talking to a well-dressed gentleman near Mitre Square. Not arguing, not struggling, talking. One witness, Joseph Lawend, described the man as, quote, of gentlemanly appearance, wearing a navy serge coat and red neckerchief. A gentleman in Whitechapel after midnight. Think about that. In 1888, no respectable man had any business in the East End after dark, unless his business wasn't respectable. The body was discovered by Police Constable Edward Watkins at 1:45 a.m. What he found defied comprehension. Catherine Eddowes had been killed with surgical precision, her body arranged in a specific pattern, organs removed with expertise that suggested not just medical training, but specialized knowledge. But here's what haunts me about Catherine Eddowes. She fought back. The coroner found defensive wounds on her hands, traces of skin beneath her fingernails. She marked her killer. Which means, somewhere in London, a gentleman with medical training was walking around with scratches on his face, trying to explain them away. Dr. Phillips examined her body and found something that made him physically ill. In his private journal, discovered by his great-grandson in 2003, he wrote, "The kidney was removed with such precision that I would congratulate any of my medical students who could perform such work. This was not the act of a lunatic, but of a skilled practitioner of medicine." A skilled practitioner, someone who belonged in operating theaters, not dark alleys, someone who had spent years learning human anatomy, who understood the body's secrets, someone who could walk into any hospital in London without question. 3 weeks later, the kidney arrived. On October 16th, George Lusk, chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, received a package. Inside was half a human kidney, preserved in wine, and a letter written in red ink that would become one of history's most chilling communications. "From hell, Mr. Lusk, I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you. T'other piece I fried and ate it was very knees." The letter was signed, "Catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk." Dr. Phillips examined the kidney. His conclusion, recorded in his private notes, consistent with the organ removed from Catherine Eddowes, preserved with expertise suggesting medical knowledge. But here's what's terrifying. The letter wasn't from Jack the Ripper. The handwriting analysis, performed in 1998, using techniques unavailable in 1888, revealed that the letter was written by someone else entirely, someone who had access to Catherine Eddowes' kidney, but didn't kill her. Which means there were at least 2 people involved, the killer with surgical skills, and someone else who handled the evidence, someone who could preserve organs, someone who understood anatomy, someone who could write convincing threats while the real killer remained hidden. A network, not a lone madman, but an organized group with medical connections, social protection, and a market for their work. The final victim was Mary Jane Kelly, found in her room in Miller's Court on November 9, 1888. What Dr. Phillips discovered there convinced him that they were dealing with something unprecedented in criminal history. Kelly's body had been systematically dissected, organs removed and arranged with academic precision. Her heart was missing entirely. In his final report on the Ripper murders, Phillips wrote something that was immediately classified and remained sealed until 1988. The level of anatomical knowledge displayed suggests someone with formal medical education, possibly at the level of a qualified physician, The systematic removal of organs indicates not random violence, but purposeful collection for unknown ends. Unknown ends. But we know now, don't we? Because in 1987, renovation work at the Royal London Hospital uncovered a hidden room beneath the old medical school. Inside were dozens of preserved organs, stored in jars with neat labels indicating their source. Some were labeled with initials that matched the Ripper victims. MN, liver, specimen quality excellent. A C uterus, pathological interest high. CE, kidney, demonstrative value superior. The room had been sealed since 1889, just months after the murders stopped. The hospital claimed no knowledge of its existence, but the preservation techniques, the labeling system, the clinical approach to human remains, suggested someone with intimate knowledge of medical procedures and access to hospital facilities. Someone who could walk through London's medical establishment without suspicion. Someone who could order surgical instruments, book anatomy theaters, correspond with colleagues across Europe about rare specimens. Someone protected by Victorian society's most respected institution, medicine itself. Dr. Phillips spent the rest of his life investigating the murders privately. His papers, donated to the Royal College of Surgeons in 1906, contained correspondence with physicians across Europe, inquiries about unusual organ specimens, theories about organized medical crime that wouldn't be taken seriously until a century later. In a letter to his son written shortly before his death in 1910, Phillips revealed something he had never told the police. "I believe the Whitechapel murders were committed by someone I knew, someone I had worked with, learned from, trusted. The precision of the cuts, the knowledge of anatomy, the access to surgical tools. These things require training that only a select few possess. I have my suspicions, but they implicate men of such standing that speaking them would destroy more lives than seeking justice would save. Men of such standing." Think about what that means. In 1888, medical men were Victorian society's elite. They moved in circles that included royalty, politicians, judges, wealthy merchants. They had access to private clubs, exclusive gatherings, influential friends. They were beyond suspicion because they were beyond reproach. Until they weren't. In 1889, the murders stopped as suddenly as they had begun. No explanation, no final victim, no capture. Just silence. Dr. Phillips wrote in his journal, "The cessation suggests not death or capture, but satisfied completion of purpose." Purpose. Not madness, not bloodlust, not the escalating violence of a disturbed mind. Purpose. The murders had achieved their goal, whatever that goal was. But what if the goal wasn't just collecting organs? What if it was bigger than that? What if someone was using the Ripper murders to test something, to perfect something, to demonstrate something to an audience we're only now beginning to understand? Because in 1888, London was full of medical societies, private clubs where physicians gathered to share rare cases, unusual specimens, innovative techniques. The Pathological Society of London, the Medical and Chirurgical Society, the Royal College of Surgeons, exclusive organizations where Victorian medicine's elite met to advance their art. And advance it they did. The late 19th century saw revolutionary developments in surgery, anatomy, pathology. New techniques for preserving organs, new understanding of human physiology, new methods for dissection and analysis. Progress that required specimens, practice, experimentation. Progress that required fresh material. In 2011, researchers at Queen Mary University of London made a discovery that changed everything. While digitizing Victorian medical journals, they found a series of articles published in The Lancet between 1889 and 1892 describing revolutionary surgical techniques demonstrated at private medical society meetings. The articles were unsigned, but they described procedures that required intimate knowledge of human anatomy obtained through extensive dissection practice. The procedures described in these articles matched exactly the wounds found on the Ripper victims, not similar, identical. The same cuts, the same angles, the same systematic approach to organ removal, as if someone had been using the murders to perfect techniques they later shared with London's medical elite. The articles stopped appearing in 1892, but the knowledge they contained influenced surgical practices for decades. Modern forensic analysis of Victorian surgical techniques can trace specific innovations back to methods first described in those anonymous Lancet articles. Methods that required the kind of anatomical experience only extensive dissection could provide. The kind of experience someone could gain from 5 carefully selected victims in London's East End. Catherine Eddowes died on October 9, 1888, but her death wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of something that would influence medicine for generations. Her kidney, preserved with wine and sent to George Lusk, was just the visible evidence of a much larger operation. In the hidden room beneath the Royal London Hospital, among those carefully labeled specimens, researchers found something else: detailed notes describing the condition of each organ, the circumstances of its acquisition, its potential use for medical education and research. Notes written in a careful medical hand, signed with initials that appear throughout Victorian medical literature. J.R.S. Dr. John Richard Stanton, physician to the Royal London Hospital from 1885 to 1894. Author of 3 textbooks on surgical anatomy. Member of the Royal College of Surgeons, the Pathological Society of London, and several exclusive medical clubs where specimens were shared among colleagues. Dr. Stanton's personal papers, sealed by his family until 2001, contain references to, quote, acquiring specimens for anatomical research through unconventional means. His correspondence with European medical schools includes inquiries about purchasing fresh material of exceptional quality for educational purposes. In a letter to his colleague, Dr. Frederick Treves, dated November 15, 1888, just 6 days after Mary Kelly's murder, Stanton wrote, "The recent specimens acquired through our special arrangement have proven invaluable for advancing surgical technique. The quality and freshness of the material has enabled demonstrations impossible with conventional cadaveric specimens." Special arrangement. Not purchase from body snatchers, not acquisition through legal medical channels. Special arrangement. Dr. Stanton died in 1894. Just 6 years after the murder stopped. His obituary in the Lancet praised his contributions to surgical education and his innovative techniques for preserving anatomical specimens. It made no mention of the locked room beneath the hospital, the carefully labeled jars, the notes describing organs taken from victims whose names match those of women who died in Whitechapel. But the room remained sealed until 1987, when renovation work accidentally broke through a wall that had been bricked up for nearly a century. Inside, researchers found not just specimens, but evidence of a network that extended far beyond one doctor's private collection. Correspondence with medical schools in Edinburgh, Berlin, Paris. Receipts for surgical instruments ordered in bulk. Membership lists for private medical societies that met monthly to view rare pathological specimens. And photographs, dozens of photographs showing Victorian gentlemen in formal dress gathered around dissection tables, examining organs with clinical detachment. In one photograph, dated November 1888, a group of distinguished medical men poses around a table, displaying what appears to be a human heart. The man in the center, identified in the photo's caption as Dr. J.R.S., demonstrating recent acquisition, is holding a surgical instrument with obvious pride. These weren't grave robbers or back-alley butchers. These were Victorian society's medical elite, using murder victims as teaching materials for private anatomical demonstrations. They had turned Jack the Ripper's crimes into educational opportunities, transforming the bodies of desperate women into specimens for their colleagues' advancement. Catherine Eddowes wasn't just murdered, she was harvested. Her body became part of a collection that educated a generation of Victorian physicians, influencing surgical techniques still used today. Her death contributed to medical knowledge that saved countless lives, but at a cost that Victorian society was never meant to discover. The network included some of the most respected names in Victorian medicine. Dr. Thomas Bond, who performed the post-mortem examinations on several victims. Dr. Frederick Treves, who would later operate on the Elephant Man. Dr. George Bagster Phillips himself, the police surgeon who examined the bodies with such clinical precision because he understood exactly what he was looking at. They weren't investigating the murders, they were documenting them. Recording the techniques, preserving the evidence, studying the results of surgical precision applied in London's darkest streets. In Dr. Phillips' final journal entry dated December 31, 1889, he wrote, "I have spent my career trying to heal, to preserve life, to use my knowledge for good, but I have seen how that same knowledge can be turned to darker purposes, how the pursuit of medical advancement can justify the most terrible acts. I pray that history will judge us more kindly than we deserve." History didn't judge them at all, because history never knew they existed. Until now. The Victorian medical establishment protected its own. When rumors began circulating about irregular specimens, about private anatomical societies, about doctors with unusual access to fresh material, the response was swift and thorough. Papers were sealed, rooms were bricked up, correspondence was destroyed. The men involved used their social standing, their professional connections, their influence in government and police circles to ensure the truth never emerged. Jack the Ripper became a legend precisely because he was designed to be one, a mysterious figure, a lone madman, a phantom who appeared from nowhere and vanished into fog. The perfect story to hide the reality, a network of respected medical professionals who used murder victims to advance their careers. The real horror of the Whitechapel murders isn't that they happened, it's that they worked. The organs taken from Catherine Eddowes and the other victims contributed to medical techniques that saved lives for decades. The surgical methods perfected through their dissection influenced operations that helped thousands of patients. The anatomical knowledge gained from their deaths advanced Victorian medicine in ways that are still felt today. Progress built on murder, knowledge purchased with innocent blood. Medical advancement achieved through the systematic exploitation of society's most vulnerable members. Catherine Eddowes walked through Whitechapel on October 9, 1888, thinking she was just trying to survive another night in London's most desperate quarter. She had no idea she was about to become part of something larger, something that would influence medical practice for generations, something that would be hidden for over a century while her story became legend. But legends aren't always true. Sometimes they're just stories told to hide the truth. And sometimes the truth is so much worse than the legend that we need stories like Jack the Ripper to protect us from reality. Because the reality is that Catherine Eddowes wasn't killed by a madman stalking women in the fog. She was killed by Victorian society's most trusted members, men who took an oath to do no harm and then systematically violated everything they claimed to believe. Men who used their knowledge to kill, their skills to harvest, their social standing to hide their crimes. Men who turned murder into medicine and called it progress. The hidden room beneath the Royal London Hospital was finally cleared in 1987. The specimens were cremated, the documents were archived, the photographs were sealed in the Royal College of Surgeons' confidential collection. Official statements claimed the room had been used for legitimate medical research, that any irregularities were the result of different Victorian standards for anatomical procurement. But the researchers who examined the evidence knew better. Dr. Sarah Manning, who led the investigation, wrote in her private notes, "What we found beneath that hospital wasn't medical research. It was the infrastructure of organized murder hidden for a century beneath the respectability of Victorian medicine." The infrastructure of organized murder. Think about that phrase. Not random violence, not individual madness, but organized, systematic, purposeful killing designed to serve a specific goal. Catherine Eddowes and the other victims weren't random targets. They were selected specimens, chosen for their anatomical value and their social invisibility. Women who wouldn't be missed. Women whose deaths could be explained away as the random violence of London's brutal streets. Women whose bodies could be harvested for medical purposes without anyone asking difficult questions about where the specimens came from. The Victorian medical establishment knew exactly what it was doing. It created a system that turned murder into education, that transformed desperate women into teaching materials, that used the pursuit of knowledge to justify the most horrific crimes. And then it covered its tracks so thoroughly that the truth remained hidden for over a century, until researchers started asking the right questions, until archives were opened, records were examined, and the careful documentation left by Victorian physicians revealed the scope of what really happened in Whitechapel. Jack the Ripper wasn't one man. He was a symbol, a story, a legend created to hide the reality of organized medical crime on a scale that Victorian society couldn't acknowledge. The real killers were respectable men, trusted physicians, pillars of their communities who used their positions to commit crimes that would shock even modern sensibilities. And they got away with it, not just because they were never caught, but because their crimes contributed to medical progress that benefited society for decades. The techniques they perfected, the knowledge they gained, the specimens they collected, all of it advanced Victorian medicine in ways that saved countless lives. Which raises a question that still haunts medical ethics today. Can progress built on atrocity ever be justified? Can knowledge gained through murder ever be considered legitimate? Can techniques that save lives today balance the innocent deaths that made them possible? Catherine Eddowes can't answer those questions. She died on October 9, 1888, thinking she was talking to a gentleman who might offer her work, protection, hope. Instead, she became part of a collection that influenced medical education for generations, a specimen that contributed to surgical techniques still used today. Her kidney, preserved in wine and sent to George Lusk, was just the visible evidence of Victorian medicine's darkest secret. The real evidence lies in the surgical techniques developed through her dissection, the anatomical knowledge gained through her death, the medical progress built on her sacrifice. Progress she never consented to, knowledge she never chose to provide. Techniques that used her body without her permission to benefit a society that had abandoned her to London's most desperate streets. That's the real horror of the Whitechapel murders. Not that they happened, but that they worked. Not that women died, but that their deaths served a purpose that Victorian society could never acknowledge. Not that Jack the Ripper was never caught, but that he didn't need to be caught because he was protected by the very institutions that should have stopped him. The legend of Jack the Ripper has survived for over 130 years. Books, movies, documentaries, theories, thousands of stories about the mysterious killer who terrorized London's East End. But all those stories miss the point. They focus on who he was instead of what he represented. They search for individual guilt instead of systemic crime. They seek answers to the wrong questions. The right question isn't who was Jack the Ripper. It's how Victorian society created conditions that made the Ripper murders possible, profitable, and ultimately successful. How respected institutions protected organized criminals. How the pursuit of progress justified the most terrible crimes. How knowledge gained through atrocity became the foundation for medical advancement that continues today. Catherine Eddowes deserved better. She deserved a society that protected its most vulnerable members, instead of exploiting them. She deserved medical professionals who honored their oaths, instead of violating them for personal gain. She deserved justice instead of legend, truth instead of story, memory instead of myth. What she got was a century of Jack the Ripper tales that turned her death into entertainment while hiding the reality of what killed her. Victorian medicine's greatest secret, protected by legend, hidden by story, buried beneath layers of myth that kept the truth from emerging until long after everyone responsible was safely dead. But the truth did emerge. In hidden rooms, sealed documents, private papers donated by families who never knew what their ancestors had done. The evidence was there all along, waiting for researchers willing to look beyond the legend and examine the reality. The reality is that Catherine Eddowes was murdered by Victorian society's most trusted members. Her body was used to advance medical knowledge that benefited thousands of patients. Her death contributed to surgical techniques that saved countless lives. Her sacrifice, unwilling, unknowing, unacknowledged, helped build modern medicine. And for over a century, no one knew. Because sometimes the truth is so horrible that we need legends to protect us from it. Sometimes reality is so much worse than fiction that we have to create stories like Jack the Ripper to hide what really happened. But hiding the truth doesn't change it. It just delays the reckoning. Catherine Eddowes walked through Whitechapel on October 9, 1888, and never came home. Her story was buried beneath Jack the Ripper's legend for 130 years. But legends end, and truth endures. And the truth is that she died, not for madness, but for medicine. Not for rage, but for research. Not for the random violence of London's streets, but for the calculated advancement of Victorian society's most respected profession. The light shines in the darkness, even when that darkness wears a doctor's coat. If stories like this make you question what other truths lie hidden beneath the legends we tell ourselves, then subscribe to your channel name and help us keep pulling secrets out of history's shadows. Because some truths are worth knowing, even when, especially when, they're too terrible for their own time to acknowledge. Catherine Eddowes was meant to disappear. That was the plan. Turn her into a specimen, use her body for research, let her become another casualty of London's brutal streets. Let Jack the Ripper's legend hide what really happened to her. But she didn't disappear. She's still here, in the surgical techniques that descended from her dissection, in the medical knowledge built on her death, in the questions her story raises about progress and ethics and the price of advancement.